Thank you so much. It's a great privilege to be here, and I'm very honored to have been invited. As you heard from the introduction, I'm a little bit exceptional in the program in two ways. In one way, I seem to be not very exceptional, the fact that I'm a man on the program where we don't have any women speakers, which is a little unfortunate. But I am exceptional in the sense that I am a political scientist. I work interdisciplinarily, but it's definitely a different perspective to the other presentations we've heard so far today. And I'm exceptional because I don't work on the Holocaust. That's probably even more defining for this presentation. I come to you today with a comparative perspective, which draws heavily on my work in Cambodia. So here you can see some pictures from an exhibition that I curated together with the photographer Daniel Welschenbach. It's a very big screen, so they seem a little pixelated, I'm afraid. But what we see here are very ordinary men and women who participated in the Khmer Rouge in the late 1970s in Cambodia. And doing the research that I did in Cambodia, where there's been relatively little work done so far in the past on why people participated in this genocidal regime, I wanted to try and understand whether the dynamics in this very different case, which looks very different to what we see here in the Ukraine or in Rwanda or any of the other cases, but to see whether some of the dynamics and some of the motivations that propelled these people to engage in violence were maybe comparable. And so I did this research, and to already tell you the conclusion, I would say there are lots of similarities between these cases. While I was opening the exhibition I think it was in Frankfurt, I stood sort of milling around before I gave a talk, and I heard a couple talking about this portrait of this man, who indeed had killed several hundred people during the Khmer Rouge period. And they said, I heard the woman say to her partner or husband, you can see the evil in his eyes. And I looked back at this photo and I said to myself, no, I don't see the evil in his eyes. I do see the evil acts that he did, but the academic discourse has moved on from this. This is not new. Hannah Arendt already taught us about the banality of evil. And with my approach, I try to show a new perspective, which I call the complexity of evil, which agrees with the mundaneness and the everyday nature of many of the motivations, but tries to embed them in a more complex framework. So, as I said, I work interdisciplinarily from my political science training, but trying to integrate also sociological concepts, the many insights from history, social psychology, criminology, and try to merge the theoretical frameworks which have been provided to talk about genocide and mass violence, and also the empirical research from the Holocaust and Rwanda, where the two cases and where there's been the most work done, as well as some of the beginnings of work in Bosnia and Cambodia. And then I meshed this with my own field work, which I drew on 6 months of field work in 2014 across 10 provinces in Cambodia, where altogether I conducted interviews with 58 former Khmer Rouge, visiting them multiple times and trying to understand their perspectives. Now, it's a very big screen. I didn't mean my book cover to be quite so large. But what I try and do in this new publication is to provide a heuristic, a perspective of trying to understand how people come to participate across a lot of different cases, and try and sort these causally, to try and differentiate between different types of factors. And here it's important to me that what I'm doing is I'm looking at why people engage in certain types of actions, that is, violent action, rather than thinking of them as perpetrators and why they become perpetrators, because this enables us to understand how motivations can also change over time. I think that as historians, you're very sensitive to this aspect, which I think my social scientific colleagues are possibly less sensitive to. And very importantly, the key to this is the subjective understanding of the individuals themselves. So, This will grow into the large model in the end. What I'm trying to explain, as I said, is participation. And I differentiate between three types of motivations. And for me, a motivation is the actual impetus for why someone participates, the actual underlying reason. And here, the first group are in-group motivations. That's social dynamics within the perpetrator group that motivate someone to engage in violent action. Here we have different types of pressures exerted by either superiors or peers, either explicitly or implicitly, for instance, through peer pressure. But it's, and this can also be laced with coercion in some, and threats towards the perpetrator if they don't participate. And some of these threats are more credible in some contexts than in others. But also ideas of within the group of status, of gaining certain esteem within the group can be important, and taking on roles. One of my interviewees in Cambodia said that when he joined the Khmer Rouge, he knew he was entering into a tiger zone. That was the name of the exhibition that I curated. And he knew that by entering into this tiger zone, he had to become a tiger. He had to take on the morals of a tiger and the actions of a tiger. I think this speaks quite significantly to the social psychological work on this issue. The second group of motivations are out-group motivations. These are ideological and emotional responses to and opinions of the victim group. And so here, ideas of anti-Semitism are important, hatred, ideas about revenge. And there are, as we all know, people who do adhere to these motivations. But as we'll see, the category of ideology also comes up later in other forms. And lastly, we have what was also featured in the last presentation, were these what I call opportunistic motivations. So here we have materiality through economic gain, for instance, through looting, career perspectives or personal conflicts which are then decided through the use of violence under the guise of genocide. And in the end, we also have ideas such as thrills and excitement or sadistic tendencies, which also provide individual benefits to the perpetrators. And this is a little bit what we were also hearing as part of the presentation of Edward Westerman. Now, very briefly, I'm going to sort of try and highlight a little bit about what I found in Cambodia, contrast it with some of the insights from the Holocaust, and then continue. But obviously, this is very, very schematic, and just as sort of a little view of some of the ideas that I try to develop in full length in the book. But in Cambodia, for instance, motivations, authority and coercion are really key. Within the totalitarian state controlled by ONCAR, the organization of the Khmer Rouge, these took on a very high significance. As I said, also taking on a role, this metaphor of becoming a tiger was also quite important, as was status. In a cultural setting in which hierarchies and social hierarchies are very important, becoming a Khmer Rouge was a way for people to gain a higher status within their culture when they often came from very low status backgrounds. And when we talk about opportunism, in Cambodia, it's not about looting or getting rich. In a regime where 2 million out of 7 million people died or were killed during the Khmer Rouge, but hundreds of thousands of those died from hunger as well. And so for many people, being part of the Khmer Rouge and not losing that position by engaging in acts of violence was also a route to being able to have access to food and better living conditions. Many people spoke to me of their hopes for security, that they themselves wouldn't be targeted as enemies. This was often actually not a very good strategy. It didn't work out, but from their perspective, that was their motivation. In the end, many Khmer Rouge were themselves also killed. In the Holocaust, we see ideas of authority, particularly within organizational structures that we've heard a lot about within the Einsatzgruppen and the SS. Although the threats of coercion within the case of the Holocaust were obviously much less pronounced than they were in Cambodia. Social bonds of camaraderie and the social dynamics within these groups were very key, as, for instance, the work of Browning also showed. And within opportunism, there are much more, and we heard about this already, more structured perspectives on material gain, various perks that being in these positions entailed, and career perspectives that people could have through their participation. Okay. The second part of the model is facilitative factors. These are factors, and this is a lot of the literature, is me dividing up between motivations and facilitative factors. These are factors which make it easier for someone to participate, but they're not actually the impetus for someone to do it. So if only a facilitative factor is present, then someone won't participate. And here I argue that a lot of the ideology is set. So that it creates a framework within which the killing becomes necessary or sensical, legitimate, but that's not actually necessarily the impetus for many people to actually then engage. But this is much more relied in the social dynamics or opportunistic motivations I was speaking about before. But there are also lots of other factors, like moral disengagement, where people where psychological mechanisms create a distance between the act themselves and their moral framework. Group dynamics in which responsibility can be dispersed or displaced are important, as are factors of time. Now here in Cambodia, we see very different, you notice I didn't mention social dynamics very prominently in the motivations because of the structure of the Khmer Rouge, which relied very strongly on social isolation. So they're very different dynamics to, say, in the Holocaust. But they did have then impacts on the facilitative factors. Meaning that displacement, there was often, whereas in the Holocaust we'll see that there's a diffusion of responsibility. This was often displaced to along the very strong hierarchy to superiors. But also the anonymity which social isolation provided to many of the perpetrators who I was speaking to meant that it became easier for them to participate, and also social distance to many of the victims. And within this, an ideology of the threatening enemy was created, who was omnipresent, who was always needed to be looked out for, which also created part of this social isolation and the necessity of denunciation, but legitimized the killing quite strongly. And these ideologies, you can see them traced until today in the way that people speak, for instance, about Vietnamese people. In the Holocaust, Stefan Kühl's excellent work on organizational roles and how roles can shift into a zone of indifference shows how people can be habituated into roles. And again, I wouldn't say that this is a motivation, but a facilitative factor, which creates a normalization and a desensitization. Many group dynamics, such as distancing, both physical distancing, social distancing, make it easier for people to participate, as does the diffusion of responsibility within a group. And here you'll see again ideologies. Anti-Semitism plays an important legitimizing role. And while, of course, there are some people who are motivated by this, for almost everyone else, this will provide an ideological framework within which to understand the situation they're in and within which the violence becomes understandable. And the last element that I have are what I call contextual conditions. These are macro level, state level, or at least regional level conditions which frame the situation within which the perpetrators find themselves. So again, here we have ideology, but we also have things like the state. How is the state structured, and what does authority mean? So for instance, in Rwanda, we see very strong local state authority structures, which were tapped into by new genocidal radical elites, and through which certain types of motivations became thinkable, which they wouldn't be in other contexts. Uncertainty plays a very important role in how group dynamics, for instance, work, and between perpetrators, how they rely on who for information. And it's these three elements, motivations, facilitative factors, and contextual conditions, which in interaction with each other, I argue, mean that we can explain for each individual perpetrator why they engage in action at a specific moment in time. So this will be different at the moment that they first engage in violence to the second, third, or however many times, and these can shift over time. But using this model as a heuristic, I hope that it gives us a system to be able to look at perpetrators and their motivations and the wealth of data that we have. So I hope that what's become clear is that what my complexity of evil model provides is the idea that different factors can all be important, but they will have different causal roles. That yes, many of the factors I've spoken to are generic to human action in general, but also how they interact with each other and how we differentiate them as complex phenomena is important. That they change over time and that they influence each other. And that every case is, of course, different. The context is very different, but the fundamental mechanisms that work are quite comparable. And also, we see that within each of the cases, obviously, the individual perpetrators will differ in terms of the motivations they have. I argue that group dynamics within the perpetrator group are very important, as are opportunistic motivations, whereas particularly in the case of Cambodia and much of the literature on Rwanda and the Holocaust, ideology would maybe fit better in this facilitative factor category, along with psychological mechanisms that maximize moral separation and group dynamics. Thank you very much, and yeah.